Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our second Haberman Institute Focus on Culture lecture this week with Cantor Matthew Austerklein, who will be exploring Jewish national art music through the lens of piano works by famous composers. I'm going to keep my welcome very short this session and end with my usual reminder. Ask questions using the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Please be as concise as possible and use complete sentences. Questions will be discussed at the end of the lecture, but feel free to write them in at any time during the presentation. I now welcome Debbie Haberman-Perlmutter, a member of our Haberman Institute board, who will thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. Welcome, friends from near and far, to tonight's program towards a Jewish national art music, piano works from St. Petersburg at the turn of the 20th century. I am Debbie Haberman-Perlmutter, a proud member of the board of directors of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and I am honored to introduce our presenter, Cantor Matthew Austerklein. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all who are new to the Haberman Institute. Our mission is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. We invite you to learn more about the Haberman Institute programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. Our focus on culture continues next week with a screening of the Jewish Film Festival favorite, Call Me Dancer. Register to watch this film at home, and then please join us online for a talk with the director and lead protagonist on March 11th. Again, you can learn more about what's coming up next at habermaninstitute.org. I am especially touched to be part of tonight's program as it is dedicated to my family's close friend, Anita Solomon. The Hack family, also longtime friends of ours, is delighted to sponsor this lecture as a tribute to Dr. Anita Solomon, whose passion for music, lifelong learning, and Judaism, as well as her devotion to family and friends, are an inspiration. Anita's love for piano began at age 10. Now, 89 years old, she continues to practice daily and take lessons. She has brought her personal love of the creative arts, especially music and poetry, into her work as a practicing psychologist helping children and adults. As a longtime member of Washington Hebrew congregation, Anita feels blessed to have shared a close friendship with my father, Rabbi Joshua Haberman, Zichrono Livracha, and my mother, Maxine. She has many fond memories of attending Haberman Institute seminars, weekend retreats, and lectures, first with her beloved husband, Fred Solomon, and later with her fiance, Sam Hack, both of blessed memory. Thanks to the Hack family for their sponsorship tonight. And now on to this evening's presentation. Cantor Matthew Austerklein is a musician, scholar, and innovator in the American cantorate. He fell in love with the cantorial arts while studying abroad in Vienna, Austria, where he also studied voice with mezzo-soprano Paulette Vineyard Herbige. Matt graduated summa cum laude from the College of William and Mary with a BA in music in 2006. He went on to receive a Master's of Sacred Music and Cantorial Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2011. Cantor Austerklein has served with distinction as a pulpit cantor in Bethesda, Maryland, Akron, Ohio, and Sarasota, Florida. Passionate about writing and scholarship, his essays on Jewish music and the cantorate are featured in the Journal of Synagogue Music, Times of Israel, and Hebrew College Community's blog. He is the editor of two books, Tefilat Shmuel, The Writings of Cantor Samuel Rosenbaum, and Ilu Finu, A Cappella for Jewish Prayer, both published by the Cantors Assembly. Just before the pandemic, Cantor Austerklein completed a prestigious Polanski Research Fellowship at the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Oxford University. In 2020, he went on to become a doctoral candidate in Jewish studies at Halle-Wittenberg University in Germany. His dissertation examines the musical specialization of Ashkenazi cantors from 1500 to 1800, analyzing the genesis of cantorial thought and musical professionalism. Cantor Austerklein is married to Rabbi Alyssa Joy Austerklein, and they have 2 musical and creative children. Thank you, Cantor, for sharing your insights with us this evening. The Zoom box is yours.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you to Matt and Becky and to the Haberman Institute for having me tonight, broadcasting to you live from here in Akron, Ohio. It's a pleasure to honor Miss Solomon tonight and her love of music with a session about music. Speaking of which, I'm going to need you all out there who I can't see faces of except for our wonderful hosts to do me one favor, and that favor is please turn up your sound. Why, do you ask? Because I'm going to be playing piano music, and sometimes the piano is very, very quiet. So please turn up your sound. That way you'll be able to hear me quite well and the piano quite well as well. Now, so take a minute, turn up the volume. Good. Tonight is about Jewish national art music, which sounds a little sort of related to high society and things like that, but really we're dealing with a very deep question. What is Jewish music? What defines the music of our people? And who gets to make that decision? You see, in our era today, we take for granted the idea of countries, of nations that all speak the same language, more or less, that have a definable culture. But these ideas are largely experienced by our modern life and the history of modernity, especially the idea that there is somehow culturally essential musical forms and practices that might be essentially Jewish. This is an idea that dramatically swept into the West with the German theorist Johann Gottfried Herder. Herder coined the word Volkslied, which you guys know, just in English, as folk song. He coined this word in the 1770s. Here, rather than the aristocracy or the church defining what music is, he articulated it was actually the third estate, the Volk, the people, the Am, the nation, were the source of musical authenticity and authority. This is the musical beginning of the spirit of popular nationalism that later came to define the political movements of, sorry, here's my notes here. There we go. The political movements and the music of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the Jews were no exception to this. With the dawning of emancipation, Jews, as you know, poured their energies into being citizens of these countries they could finally more or less be citizens of, right? Into participating in the great and emerging countries of Europe. The Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Holland, and as we'll get to today, the Russian Empire. But at a certain point, the Europeans and then the Jews themselves began to consider that the Jews, might have a separate root for their national spirit. They might not have a German national spirit in them or a French one. They might really have a Jewish one. This is an idea that politically comes together with the rise of Zionism, but the music part had a long way to catch up. So since we're going to listen to pianists today, I'm going to share a provocative statement from a famous pianist that you might have heard of, a guy with very long fingers. His name was Franz Liszt, and he wrote this about Jews in 1859. Now, this is a little before the era with all the beautiful piano music we're going to hear, but it does relate to someone that I know some of you know if you go to shul. So let us do as we did in the old country. We will do the sharing of the screen. Wie in der Alterheim. All right, everyone see the screen? Good. Do I get a nod? Very good. Okay. Let's go to Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt writes a book. Let me see, get to the next slide if I can do that. Yes. There we are. Look at that Shane Punim, but an anti-Semite in many ways. We'll see why. He writes his own little essay. It's in a book on Hungarian music and gypsy music, but he writes his own little essay called Jewry in Music, very much like the one that Wagner wrote, at least in the title. But he says, I'm going to read 3 little pages of this, and you'll get to the heart of this, what will become the European anti-Semitic critique of Jewish music. Quote, "The Jews have cultivated the arts too until they have taken over every last bit of that field. What they have accomplished there is like what they have accomplished earlier in astrology. They have practiced and produced without belief in what they are doing. They have never realized how art, by grace of inspiration, creates. For when art is uttered, so too is creation. The difference between creation and innovation is the same as that between genius and talent, between Bach and Mendelssohn, between Beethoven and Meyerbeer. The Israelites have never discovered new forms," Liszt goes on to say. "They have never created any tradition of architecture, painting, music, song, or poetry that express the inner sensitivities of these people so that one could consider them national arts. More than any other art form, they have appropriated music, and what brilliant success they have had with it. Limiting their ambitions to skillful imitation, they determined to imitate the best of what we possess. And they knew it when they saw it. The Jews are very clever in arranging the elements of what we, Germans, create." Last section. One would like to believe that the Israelites possessed their own arts before they rose to power as an independent tribe. If that were the case, inspiration would shine through in their works, their perceptions and their passions would take on life in the world of artistic ideals. One time only did we have the fearsome experience of seeing and hearing what Jewish art could become when the Israelites pour out the full splendor of their fantasy and dreams into forms created by their Asiatic genius, with the intensity of feeling and of their suppressed passions. Then the glow of their fire appeared, this intense fire, which they intentionally cover with ashes so that we think it is cold. So this is a big, big accusation. To titrate it down, Liszt is accusing Jews of having no national music. They are coming into the profession of music, taking German music, what's essentially theirs, Bach, Beethoven, and just innovating in forms that are not part of their folk spirit. They're not part of their folk tradition. But Liszt is about to point to one person that you guys know as the example of the Asiatic, the Oriental genius of the Jews, of some person. What person could he have met that would have showed authentic Jewish national music? Here's some, you know his music. Here it is. Ein kamocha ba'elokim Hashem b'ein k'masecho. Right? We do this every single Shabbat morning, Orthodox to liberal to renewal. Everybody does Solomon Zulzer's Ein Kamocha. Solomon Zulzer is the guy that Liszt hears and says this guy has Jewish national music. Why did he say that? And believe me, we'll get to the piano, but we have to understand what we're really getting at when we're saying what is a Jewish national music. Solomon Zulzer gets brought into Vienna to be the cantor of a modern synagogue. And what he does is he takes the ungepatchkid, overblown Baroqueisms of the countryside Jews that have kind of come up over the last 100 years, and he does what any good romantic's going to do. He's going to get it down to its essential folk elements, the basic parts of what Cantor called the nusach, right? The basic parts of synagogue chant, and then he sets them artistically with Western choral harmony. That's where Ein Kamocha and all that stuff comes in, because Zulzer was able to do exactly what Liszt and all of his nationalist buddies writing nationalist European music did, which was get the folk tradition and then set it in beautiful artistic forms. Solomon Zulzer, by the way, wasn't just a person who did that folk work that he turned into classical styled music. He also was an art song singer himself. Liszt himself accompanied Sulzer in singing Schubert songs. And actually, on the bottom left of this, you can see there's a setting of the Schubert song Die Allmacht by Franz Liszt. And we know from a couple of accounts that Franz Liszt based his own arrangement of this Schubert song on the experience of hearing Cantor Solomon Sulzer sing it in an off-the-books recital, which he had been forbidden from giving recitals like this. But for the occasional person who was in the know, they could hear him. So this is a long way of saying that in this world of Europe, there is this accusation that Jews who have just entered the music profession actually are just imitating our folk spirit, what our national music. They're not developing their own national music. So what's going to happen? Jews are going to wake up and try to develop their own national music. And we're going to see that at work now in the Russian Empire through the lens of its piano music. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. There we go. Well, where's I'm missing I'm going to go Anton Rubinstein. Now we're going to Russia. So I'm going to speak a lot about the developments of Jewish musicality and Jewish national music in Russia, but you don't have to take my word for it. I highly recommend the work of James Leffler, who I believe has taught for the Haberman Institute on human rights. He also writes on Jewish music history. He wrote this book, The Most Musical Nation, in 2010, and made the rounds with it after doing wonderful archival research in Russia and Ukraine, back when you could do that. But let me say, speaking of pianists, let's dive into this history with who was the man who was deemed the successor to Franz Liszt, the converted Jew Anton Rubinstein, or as his critics would call him later, Rebenstein. So Anton Rubinstein was born into a Jewish family. They converted for the convenience of being able to make it in Christian and Russian society. And Anton Rubinstein, not the same as Arthur Rubinstein, who we know from the 20th century, but Anton Rubinstein was the premier virtuoso Russian pianist of the 19th century. He toured the USA, he toured Russia and Eastern Europe. I think I remember Dr. Leffler said that he did a 280-day tour of the United States, during which he did 210 or 220 concerts. So he was a serious recitalist. But not just that. He was one of the teachers of Tchaikovsky. He wrote 20 operas. He was a major voice in Russian music, not Jewish music, in Russian music in the middle of the 19th century. He was the pianist, seen as the successor to Liszt himself. Now, Rubinstein did write some Jewish-influenced pieces, though for him, the Jewishness was simply a subsection of just being Oriental. He didn't think all these nations had different spirits. He thought there was the spirit of the West and the spirit of the East, and the Jew was a part of that Asiatic type of person of the East. This is the era of Orientalism and lots of different things. But when asked about the Jewish melodies later in his life, he remarked what you have here. Rubinstein said, "In my musical compositions, you will find very many Jewish motifs and tunes that I heard in childhood, and which return to my memory some 30 years later. I myself am sometimes surprised how these traditional tunes and melodies materialize out of nowhere and remain haunting me, refusing to leave me in peace. These childhood musical memories revived with a special force at the beginning of the 1880s when the pogroms began in the Russian South. I never felt so close to Jews as I did then, when such a terrible storm burst out against us. I also felt myself oppressed and assaulted, and my heart bled when I read about these sad events. In proportion to how much I grow older, my sympathy for my fellow tribe members grew even more." And by the way, this seems to be a normal thing in human life. People who were sort of feeling like a little bit Jewish, things like Nebuch, October 7th, and horrible things happen, and they feel like I feel even more identified with my people, watching them suffer in these difficult times. Now, I think that's something that happens a lot in history. It shows a lot about the resilience of the Jewish people, no matter what they've done with themselves in their professional and other lives. Even in this case, as a converted Jew, a Jew converted to Christianity. So Rubinstein would in fact use some Jewish melodies in his compositions. Here is a piano. I was looking for piano examples. This is not a Jewish melody, but it is an Oriental melody. It is a Persian melody entitled El Dakhtarwan, Marche Orientale, an Oriental march, opus 93 by Anton Rubinstein. It's played, I believe, here at YIVO so much of this music of Jewish nationalism and of Jewish pianists and composers has really been championed by the Yiddish by YIVO, the Yiddish research organization in New York. So here is Ala Milchtein playing El Daktarawan, an Oriental piece by the great pianist of the 19th century, Anton Rubinstein. Turn up your volume if you haven't already. There you go. Very nice. A nice little miniature piece, right? Now, Rubinstein would go on very, very significantly. This is where we get into all the wonderful Jewish names to found this place, the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Rubinstein is the founding director in 1862, and this place would go beyond to become the incubator for, became one of the main engines of Jewish culture at the turn of the 20th century. At the 19th century drew to the close, the Russian Empire found that its conservatories were simply flooded with Jewish students. And in St. Petersburg in particular, under the tutelage of Alexander Glazunov and the probably familiar to you, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the famous Russian composer, they welcomed many talented Jews from across the empire to study. Dr. Leffler points out in his book, 34% of the student body of over 1,000 students at this conservatory in 1907 were Jewish, over 50% by 1913. To put it in perspective, there were like 4,000 something Jewish students in Russian universities in the Russian Empire in the 1910s. 1 out of every 3 university students in any subject were Jewish, were conservatory students at this specific conservatory. Over 50% Jewish, over 550 students were Jewish, all studying music in some way, shape, or form. And these are people who you get to know later, like Yasha Heifetz and Misha Elman, and famous violinists and composers, etc. So music was actually a very good profession for Jews. It allowed them a path out. We see such big numbers because it allowed them a path out of having to stay in the Pale of Settlement where Jews were restricted to live in the Russian Empire. And it also allowed them to get into university life and even to move about in Russian society in a more neutral way. This is a time of great Russian nationalism in the Russian Empire, and Jews are able to participate in Russian society as cultural figures way easier than they are in other areas of life. And so the musicians, Jews becoming musicians and going to the conservatory is a big thing that happens in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. But in this environment, especially in St. Petersburg, Jews begin to seek a place for their own national music. They have that critique of that Liszt had, and that other people like other Russians like Scriabin and other Russian composers have, that you Jews, you haven't developed your national music. It's so atrophied. So following the revolutions of 1905, Jews increasingly went from being in politics to being in culture. So Jewish musicians and composers felt they needed to cultivate their own national music, especially in the face of anti-Semitism from composers like Modest Mussorgsky, right, who said that, really they have no place at all, and he was actually fearful of the huge amount of Jews in the student bodies of Russia's conservatories. I think in Odessa, gosh, it was not as big of a conservatory, but Odessa's conservatory was like 84% Jewish. They had to do affirmative action for ethnic Ukrainians to go to that conservatory. The problem was summarized by an article anonymously written by a guy named M. Nagin. So it's Minagin. It was a joke. He wrote in 1909, quote, "They say that we Jews are the most musical nation, that the violin is our national instrument. We have given the world composers of genius. We have more professional musicians among us than any other people. And at the same time, you will hardly find another nation whose national music has been so much neglected as ours." The solution, the author praised, though, had been found in a new society, the Society for Jewish Folk Music. In November of 1908, a group of young Jewish composition graduates from Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's advanced composition class at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, together with senior Jewish members of the St. Petersburg Musical Establishment, joined together to form you can read it in the Yiddish if you got it, the Gesellschaft für Jiddische Volksmusik in Peterburg, the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg. Their goal was to apply the recently developed tools of ethnography and the ideology of musical nationalism to the music, recover and make art of the music of the Jewish nation. They wanted to go out to shtetls all across the Pale of Settlement to record the authentic folk voices. Remember Herder with the folk song, right? The authentic national folk voices of the Jewish soul, the Yiddish folk song, nigunim, klezmer, and to create artistic works of Jewish national music that would show the true spirit of their nation. These composers represented not young nationalists or minorities, but these guys were actually the elite of the general Russian musical world. Like Rubinstein, these composers were major in the scene of Russian music, but were simultaneously trying to realize that as yet unrealized goal of producing works that captured the national spirit of the Jewish people. Even with the revolution and then World War I in the background, they still believed in the urgency of this project and the need to transform and record this Jewish folk material and turn it into pieces of art and publish it and make concerts of it, just like Bela Bartok had done for Czech music and Glinka for Russian folk music. So now we're going to spend some time learning about a few major figures from this movement and hearing their pianistic works. And by the way, just so you can see here, you have a little notice from the Gesellschaft here on the left, and here on the right you have a program. Actually, you can read the Russian Programma, and it says Jüdische Volkslieder, of Jewish folk music. It's one of the many programs that these innovative young composers were involved in producing and publishing the music of. Let's start with Joel Engel. Not as well known today. He was primarily a music critic, but he became a composer and he did lots of creative work. He was actually one of the top music critics in Europe. He wrote for the Russian language daily newspaper in Moscow. But he developed a strong national pride, and he went back home to his hometown of Berdyansk to record music from his Jewish roots. Remember, this is right when the cylinders, right, that I think Edison had developed, were just becoming, and the gramophone, people were just able to go and do that kind of ethnographic work. So Engel developed a strong national pride, and he dedicated his life to preserving Jewish folk music, presenting it artistically, and programming it in concerts. He even went with the famous Ansky in 1912 through the Pale of Settlement, again, recording Jewish melodies. He went on to start a Jewish music publishing house in Berlin and wrote extensively about Jewish modes, and he even wrote popular songs that are still known in Israel today. Numi Numi and Omrim Yeshna Eretz, right? A very famous song, now famous in Israel. And Geshem Mishamayim is a kid's song. but his stuff that really got in the early days of British Mandate Palestine before the founding of the state. Here is a new recording that actually it hasn't even come out yet. It's going to come out on Purim. There's a new CD I actually highly recommend it called Art Songs of the Jewish Diaspora, which is mostly it's Yiddish and French and Ladino and all sorts of stuff, but it has a little piano bit here. The pianist is Brian Schenkman, and this is from Yoel Engel's Five Pieces for Piano. This is Nigun Am, or Volksweise. This is a folk melody that he has set for a little piano miniature. I'm going to pause that there for the moment. Again, that's Yoel Engel. Now, Mikhail Gnesin. One thing you guys should know that I didn't mention before is that not only did the St. Petersburg School welcome a lot of Jews, it also welcomed a lot of women. There are women and men both studying prolifically in large numbers together towards being professional musicians. Michal Gnesin came from a long line of Jewish musicians. 7 of the 9 children in his family were successful musicians, and 4 of his 5 sisters studied music, and the sisters founded their own musical institute, the Gnesin Musical Institute, and it's still today, in Russia, it's the most elite school for music in Russia, next to the Moscow Conservatory. Now, Gnesin was denied a place in the Moscow Conservatory when he was alive because of the anti-Jewish quotas, so he went to St. Petersburg to study with Rimsky-Korsakov in 1901. And he began more and more to use Jewish traditions in his compositions, and he went to then British Mandate Palestine for inspiration, once in 1914 and once in 1921 to 22. I'll play 2 things for you by Mikhail Gnesin. The first is not one of his Jewish pieces. This is the Requiem for Piano Quintet. I just want to give you a little flavor of his style, which was, these guys are composing in an elite, avant-garde modern style. They are, competent and very high levels within Russian music in general. And I think you can hear some of the sort of impressionist colors of that style of that era in the beginning of his piano quintet. And then I'll play some of the Jewish stuff coming next. Isn't that pretty? Really rush, really beautiful. Like just his harmonies are very cool. It's just a really nice style. I mean, I happen to like it just as a musician. That's Basinia Schulman with the Moscow Soloist Ensemble on piano. But now we have him also with Ora, a working man's dance of the Galilee. This is from right after he went on his second trip to Palestine for inspiration from the Jewish population there. Again, some of these composers were fervent Zionists. Some of them were not Zionists, but they were very much still about the project of the spirit of the Jewish people. But they were very involved. There was that sense of being politically involved as well, and being connected to all of the Jewish people, as well as being involved locally in their own Jewish Russian scene. So this is Ora Ora, a working man's dance in the Galilee. It says Ilya Blinov and Sam Zarin. All right, that's a really good piece. I know I want to keep listening to it. These are all on YouTube. What an era we live in that we can listen to all this great stuff at the not even on CD. It's just there, thanks to the people who like Sam and Ilya who have put it up online and for people to hear. Thank God, all very good. Now, another perhaps familiar name in the more in the violin world is Yosef Achron. Yosef Achron's father was a violinist and a lay cantor about tefillah, and in 1898 the family went to St. Petersburg so that Achron could enter the conservatory and study with the legendary violin teacher Leopold Auer, who was the teacher of many Jewish virtuosos, including, of course, Jascha Heifetz. He joined the Gesellschaft für Volksmusik and eventually became chairman of its music committee. Now, again, people had different ideas of how essential Jewish music had to be. Achron was a little more less essentialist and a little more assimilationist than some of his contemporaries in that he thought that good Jewish national music had to be good music, period, first. So the fact that it was a little acculturated or that was partly shaped by our ideas of what good is was totally fine and totally historical as far as he was concerned. Now, Achron had a wide-ranging career, not unlike some of our other Gesellschaft alumni, including in Berlin, New York, and finally in Los Angeles, throughout he composed classical and orchestral works, chamber pieces, and music for operas and operettas. This is one of his piano works, Chalom, which he composed when he was in Berlin in the 1920s. Sorry to pause it there. Again, you can listen to these for a while. They're so wonderful and such wonderful texture to them. Two more gentlemen from this, and then a final little anecdote. Austerklein was the son of a violinist, and all six of his siblings went into music. Just think of it. Think of a family. This many siblings are all going into music. It's a good profession for a young Jewish boy or girl, right? Normally, think, oh, become a doctor, become a lawyer. In Russia, music was your way up and out. So he studied under Josef Engel, who we saw before, and he was a passionate Jewish nationalist and member of the Gesellschaft. He was also influenced by French Impressionism. He was befriended by the famous Russian composer Alexander Scriabin, and he even landed a position in the Moscow Conservatory later on. Crane was able to make it in the system. He was given a role when the Soviets came along in administering music and was really considered the head of the Jewish art music movement in the 20s. This piece, called Suite Dansée, is not really a French piece. It's built on elements from klezmer folk dance combined with avant-garde compositional techniques. Beautiful writing. By the way, I'll tell you, this is many of these pieces for the city were played by Dr. Yasha Nemtsov. He is at the University of Weimar, and he is one of the only people, I believe it's the only place in Europe that you can get a doctorate in Jewish music specifically, is with him in Weimar. His main thing has been really bringing back a lot of these both Eastern European music and specifically, the Jewish material from this era. Now, finally, our last figure we'll get a look at right now is Lazar Saminsky, who was a product of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and who was introduced to the works of the Gesellschaft, which really gave him a sense of purpose. A lot of these guys really felt they got fired up. They weren't that Jewishly inclined. Maybe they had been converted, maybe they had not. But once they really understood the project, they felt very passionately. It really got a lot of these composers riled up. And there were many chapters of the Society for Jewish Folk Music. There was one in St. Petersburg, also in Moscow, also in Odessa, I think also in Riga. There were it really spread as a broader project throughout major cities of the Russian Empire for Jewish musicians and composers to create and program and publish this type of art music, where they'd taken their folk material and made it beautiful with the tools of Western classical music. Lazar Saminsky graduated from the St. Petersburg School in 1910, and he produced many Jewish works, 2 Hebrew song cycles, Hasidic dance for violin and piano, an Orientalia for orchestra, 4 sacred choruses, 2 Hebrew lullabies, and other works. He simultaneously was the assistant regular classical music editor of the St. Petersburg daily newspaper, the newspaper Ruskaya Mova. And he also went with Joel Engel and Ensky on those journeys to document and record on wax cylinders the melodies of Jewish peasants and Jewish people in the Pale of Settlement. He described this effort in this way: to collect all that has survived of our life, both spiritually and materially, to record tales, historical facts, folk poetry, folk sayings, to notate old Jewish melodies, to photograph old synagogues, tombstones, folk types, folk scenes of Jewish life, to collect photography, documents, and old Hebrew holy objects for a national museum. So it really is a very, archival sense of really saving something that's lost. We don't think of the shtetl as lost in the 1910s and 20s, but they did. They thought there's the war going on. We've had revolution. This way of life is already on the way out. We've got to capture it while it's still there. Saminsky, like Akron, eventually made his way to America, where he gained prominence in Manhattan as the music director of, I kid you not, Temple Emmanuel in New York City. He was there from 1924 to 1958, 34 years, where he brought this Western sophistication, but also this knowledge of Jewish folk melody to basically the flagship congregation of the American Reform movement. We think of reform as very, we got the organ, we got the formality, but not it had a huge influx of influences from Eastern Europe, not just the German foundations of it. And especially here at Emmanuel, he did a lot of amazing music that really reformed their choral program and their musical program, both with his choral selections and everything else. But here, because we're doing piano today, is the first movement of one of his early piano works entitled 10 Hebrew Folk Songs and Folk Dances. Beautiful, right? There's 9 more you can listen to online after this is done. All right, we've got 5 more minutes, and then I'll take your questions. So these composers, they really believe that they were capturing something essentially Jewish and rediscovering and curating the spirit of the nation as part of a celebration of Jewish nationalism and peoplehood. They were very passionate. But on whose terms were they doing so? I'm going to tell you a funny story that Dr. James Leffler recounts of about a 1901 publication of Jewish folk songs written by a gentleman named Mark Warshawski. Among them were things like Oifen Prepechik Brenta Feierl Unin Stubis Heis. Very famous now, very classic Jewish folk song now. It's beautiful. He shows them to this guy, publishes them, shows them to this guy who you guys know, the guy Rabinovich, who we know as Sholem Aleichem, the famous Yiddish poet. And Sholem Aleichem goes wild. These are great. He's publishing, he's making this Jewish culture. He ships them around. He's helping them to have a good success. Now, our old friend Joel Engel from up here sees this, and he takes umbrage. Oifen Pripachik! It's a forgery! You would think that Jews just sing polkas and quadrilles and mazurkas all day, all in dominant scales. It's just organ grinder music. This is fake tradition, he says. It's not from the shtetl, and therefore it can't be us. It's synthesized. Now, Engel's mission is to save and preserve Yiddish culture. And part of the mission is for, Jews to have self-determination, right? He writes down and collect Jewish song, but even while he's immersed in the heart of classical music and reviewing the latest compositions. So he's sort of living in both worlds. He has a very specific view on what's authentic, right? Now Sholem Aleichem responds, and he says in Yiddish, this is Meluchim Spruch. This is the language of the Meluchim, the rulers. You're talking with the language of the ruling authorities. What is the major, minor, authentic? What Jew doesn't know music? On what basis does Yoel Engel get to decide what music is really the soul of the Jewish nation, right? Sholem Aleichem is writing stories from scratch. They're Jewish, they're in Yiddish. Does it need to be from the shtetl to be authentically Jewish? So there's a tension there, right? That the guys who did this wonderful Jewish national music that we got to enjoy and that is really just incredibly beautiful, these guys were really using the framework of the ruling culture, of Western nationalism, to legitimate their own form of nationalism. But it's not the only way to define what Jewish music is, and the way that Jews create music, which for Sholem Aleichem, and maybe for us, is a little more egalitarian and organic. This is wise because whenever, and I'll end on this. Whenever someone tries to, with a sort of orthodoxy, lecture you on what Jewish music is, even me, you have to look at the assumptions and the processes behind that assertion. Sometimes it's not as essentialist as it looks. Sometimes Jewish music is as the Jews do. And with that, I want to open it up to questions, and thank you for joining the Haberman Institute and for having me here to talk to you today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you more about your questions from today's session.
Thank you, Cantor Austerklein, for a really very engaging talk filled with such beautiful music. For those of you out there, please go ahead and continue to type in questions into the Q&A. And we'll begin to answer some questions, and I'm sure if there's time, we can also listen to more music. You just concluded with talking about what is Jewish music, and there happens to be a number of questions. I don't know if you saying that people didn't hear anything from specific works that were Jewish music, or if there's any criteria. I don't. I know you just mentioned it, but if there's anything more you would like to say about that.
So what determines what sounds like Jewish music? Is it oi, 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 oi? Is it the scale? Is it the motif? Is it a mode? Some of these things that they were basing on actual klezmer things that they recorded may sound not Jewish to some people, right? But they actually were there recording it live. So with the dance, whether it's with the dances or with the all these other things, they were very particular in going to the source. They were very archival and very meticulous in being ethnographers of Jewish rural life. So that's really, whether you heard it or not, that's what it was. And it may be that the sort of the Jewishness is there, the what is recognizably folk to us here, like the last piece you heard, da 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 da, sounds very much like a typical Hasidic thing. But there's more Jewish music than just Hasidic music, and a lot of what the sound was made was in some ways obscured by the Western and avant-garde compositional techniques that they used. So they're not writing new Jewish folk music; they're writing Western settings of Jewish folk music, just like Zulzer was writing Western choral settings of essentialized synagogue prayer chant. Hope that answers that one. I see a question about how religiously observant were these musicians. It really was a range. Some of them presented, most of them were at least sort of maskilic. They were like Haskalah, modernizing people. But some people dressed and behaved. They were Orthodox Jews. There amongst the society, there were many Cantor's children, children of Meshurim, right, from synagogue. So they were very conversant in the sounds of synagogue life. And so there was a range of observance. But that this time, really, you could be, a national, a Russian national, and just be sort of a Jewish nationalist while being a Russian Jew. And that was, being religious wasn't the central part of it. Although it's worth reading a little more of Dr. Leffer's book to figure out more about the religiosity. I do know that actually people went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory to become chazonim, to be cantors. They needed, I need some background, in Western music. I'll go become a chazan. I'll study in St. Petersburg, and then I'll go and do that. So, other questions?
Yeah, there's a couple here that are asking about American Jewish composers in relation to the Russian Jewish composers. If there's anything you want to speak toward that.
Yeah, actually, a lot of these Russian Jewish composers became American Jewish composers. People like Achron and Saminsky. These guys made it west. They made it to America, and they were part of the scene in the before the Shoah, and even after in major American institutions. I mean, there's a bunch of them with Achron in L.A. that were very involved in it, like Lazar Feiner, other people who were, and Solomon Ravzovsky. He came in, he taught at JTS at the beginning of the cantorial program there. A lot of these guys Baruch Hashem, made it to America, and they were part of the art music scene in America. And in fact, the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg and in the Russian Empire became the inspiration for Melam, which was the equivalent by Albert Weisser in New York. So again, the influence of the Jewish National Music Project had a new life in America, much through really the direct efforts of people who moved to America from the school, but also from the broader impact of the school in its publicational output, its programmatic output, and its just impact in the larger Jewish world.
Thank you. Yeah, there's also I'm happy for you to look at them. We can kind of go back and forth, but there's a number of questions here about compositions of instruments other than the piano. I'm sure that's a whole among itself, but if there's some highlights that you want to give, like.
I just gave you the piano stuff. I mean, there's infinite things. You look up any of these composers. There's actually an index that Sam Zarin did online. And that index has just tons of, there's operas, there's operettas. These guys were involved in theater music. They were involved in choirs and orchestra and concertos. The Achron violin concerto is very famous. You can find a number of these on the Milken Archive, milkenarchive.org. That has a lot of the American Jewish music stuff, but you'll find some Achron, some Saminsky, some from Jacob Weinberg, some of the Gesellschaft people who made it west. And in doing some research, I think you could find Society for Jewish Folk Music. St. Petersburg is like the front page of milkenarchive.org right now. So you can find a little more about them there. But we could have a whole other session. I just took you through these guys through the prism of piano music, but of course that's just a little oeuvre of a huge amount of cultural production and musical composition.
Yes, thank you. I know you opened to talking about how some of Jewish works were perceived. There's another question here. Just if you want to elaborate more on how these Jewish composers' works were perceived by non-Jewish composers of the day and up, leading till today. Um,
I would say I'm not a great historian on the reception history. I do know that the in the beginning, people in the conservatory were encouraging these Jews. Judaism is awaiting a glinka, right? The Russia, like these Rimsky-Korsakov, these other Russian people are just saying, you guys aren't really doing anything with your folk tradition. We're just waiting for you to actually do it. But of course, the Shoah, both a couple of things, the efforts of all these people in Russia were really cut short by just sort of the rise of the Soviets and the way that Judaism really got suppressed under the Soviets. These guys were still around, but if they stuck around, they were more under the radar. And of course, the huge disruption of the Shoah. There is a composer in L.A., a conductor in L.A., James Conlon, who has a project. I think it's called gosh, I'm going to forget the name of it. If you Google James Conlon and like Holocaust music, you'll find he has a project of really bringing a lot of these forgotten composers that if they had made it over, for some of them who didn't, would have been, the big names. He did a lot of he's brought back a lot of their compositions. But in Russia, these again, they were, as far as I know, they were quite well received. But in recent era, they've really been forgotten, and I think that the disruption of the Shoah and the end of the Soviets has a lot to do with that.
yeah, unfortunately. Were there Jewish students from other parts of Europe, Europe, I mean, or the
Oh yeah, I mean, like what Liz was saying, like Jews were just diving into music. My theory on this actually has almost less in the Western Europe has somewhat less to do with nationalism because Jews weren't really as much trying to make Jewish national music. This is really a function of the Russian Empire and its own sort of component of nationalist stuff. Although in Berlin in the 20s, like Engel and all these guys are publishing, right? And you also have these people in Eretz Israel, with then called British Mandate Palestine. Of course, it becomes Israel. But you have all these Israeli composers also, doing their own things and putting on oratorios and composing things. So there's an international, factor to what's going on here as well.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a question here. If you want to speak toward what about Nusach Hatzafila? How that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing about Eastern European Jewish music is that the language of the synagogue and the language of the klezmer are often very similar, right? The modes that are used in worship are similar to the modes, are almost identical in many ways to the modes that are used in the instrumental repertoire, right? There are of course idioms and certain melodies that are different and that are leitmotifs for the season, for Sukkot, for different holidays. But these are very, very involved. And these were, of course, notated by Ansky. In fact, right now, there is a project going on right now. Kisselgoff was one of the guys who went on this mission of ethnography, Jewish ethnography, and a big collection of manuscripts of his just recently, in the last, I think, decade, got rediscovered and is now being transcribed by the Klezmer Institute. Walter Zev Feldman is a big klezmer scholar in New York, is at the head of that, and they've been, trying. They have a bunches of scores of transcribed, Cantor and Baltfila melodies. So these are very, very united cultures in terms of in Eastern Europe of the culture between the instrumental traditions and the synagogue traditions. The only thing I wanted to add before that I didn't get to about the Western Europe thing and Jews is that I think that in Western Europe, a lot of what's happening is that Jews are in some ways part of the creation of the canon of classical music, in that Jews knew what it was like to be part of a canonical tradition, right? Where you've got the Torah and you've got the Gemara, the Mishnah Gemara, and you master a body of work. That's what rabbinic Jews did in the yeshiva, in Jewish life. And so, of course, it's Jews who are the major collectors of Beethovenalia. It is Jews who are part of the revival of Bach. It is Jews who are part of the forming of this new canon of Western classical music, because Jews do canon. That's what we do. We've got a Torah. Now we've got a musical Torah that we're gonna, have the foundations of the Bach, the Beethovens, the Schuberts, and then we're gonna have other sort of newer Talmudic layers that go on top of these giants for whom we listen to, not in shul, but in the concert hall every year. So in some ways, it's sort of, they say that music and music is its own religion. And in some ways, this era, Jews participate in creating the scriptural canon of the religion of classical music.
Thank you. Yeah, and so is this idea of Jewish music, however it is it how is it built upon today? There, a couple people asked about sort of the influences that we see, in the world today.
Well, from this music, I will say that the cantorial schools of the United States, that is HUC and the Reform, JTS and the Conservative, and the Belt School, which is not as operative now, all really started in great debt and in great dialogue with this sort of nationalistic movement. In fact, the founders, if you go to the founders of the Cantor's Assembly, many of them were really, as much as they were trying to save chazonis and sacred music, they were really trying to save the European culture part of Jewish life that Jews have been such a participants in. And so these cantorial schools were recreated as conservatories, and they had art song, really, the style. They didn't want the opera singer so much. They wanted eventually really wanted the art song singer, right? The singer who would sing folk song with piano, because that sensitivity to text and that sensitivity to folk material was very important. And so really the Cantor has been the sort of the Cantor and some other organizations like the Milken Archive and various Jewish cultural organizations that have come and gone and come back over the years have tried to be the stewards of this particular approach of the national sort of folk to art nationalistic music approach. But of course, there is the way in which Jewish music is just like Shalom Aleichem said. It's what Jews do. What? You don't have to. It doesn't have to be based on someone in the shtetl. Warshawski can write. I can write. You can write. So that spirit's still alive today. People write Jewish music in all sorts of styles, and there's not one that's correct. There are some that are more coherent within the minhag, the customs of Ashkenazi Jews, but it doesn't have to be from the shtetl to be Jewish.
Yes, thank you. Going back to the history piece, there's a question if you can elaborate on how studying music was a way out for young people.
Oh yeah, I mean Jews. There were so many quotas in other professions and both restrictions on Jews in university settings in major other regular professional fields like being doctors and lawyers, and things like that. Um, but there was this mystique around Jews. Um, there were different theories about why Jews made great musicians. Some people, Russian major composers were like, if you don't have, one of them said, if you don't have the orchestra at least 15% Jewish, it's not going to sound right. Like you need at least 15% Jewish violins and trumpets and there was this whole like weird racial theory about Jews being feminine and masculine and feminine balance in the orchestra. They had a lot of different thoughts. But the main thing about Jews getting out is that they could go to university and they were welcomed especially in St. Petersburg, as students of music. And so you get these anecdotal stories of just parents just like sending the kid to music lesson after music lesson, because that's going to be their way out. Because they're going to be able to have a successful career. They're going to be able to go to conservatory, become part of city life, not be stuck in the Pale of Settlement, and they'll have a much more open and even neutral, as opposed to just negative for being a Jew, even a neutral role and way to make a living in the Russian Empire. And in fact, they did. They did in huge numbers.
Thank you. there's a question about the I guess it looks like the question goes in both ways, like the influence of music by Jews on Russian music, and also what were some of the earlier influences of music on the Russian traditions, uh, on the
I'm
Russian.
I'm not as schooled on the sort of influences in the Russian traditions. I mean, certainly they were doing their own project of going out to their many, huge landscape of peasants and of regular folk and recording their music. And that people like Glinka and Scriabin were doing things like that. But Jews were influencing Russian music because these guys who were in conservatories were the elite. They weren't just in Rimsky-Korsakov's class because that was the Jewish school. They were in his class because they were excellent. And they were writing about music. They weren't just writing about Jewish music. That was a side. It was a hustle. It was a side hustle. They were Yo Engel was a regular music critic. So basically, regular music critic about regular Russian music. So they are to say. I mean, there are different. I remember one person had a question like, "Is Tchaikovsky's X Symphony have a Jewish part in it?" That's not. I don't think Russians are intentionally trying to imitate Jewish music as part of their work. Modest Mussorgsky does in like Pictures in an Exhibition. He has like a Jewish melody, but he knows he's taking it and setting it because these Nebuch, these Jews, don't know how to make their own national music. So the Jews I would say their effect are really as in the sphere of just making Russian music. They do that all over the place. I don't think that the Russian music is intentionally borrowing, other than intentionally as like an Orientalism of just taking a Jewish melody and setting it.
Thank you. Yeah. And another question here is asking, what about Jewish music earlier than the last 200 years? Um, if if composers such as Beethoven influenced Jewish music and
Um, So if Beethoven, I mean, now we're getting to the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th century, and this is where I start to kick in because I studied the 1700s and the 1600s and just like right up to the beginning of the 19th century. Um, I wouldn't say that people like Beethoven and Mozart really influenced the music of the Ashkenazi Jews, but remember, Jews is a bunch of groups. The guys who really get all the big classical music are the Portuguese, the Spanish Portuguese, because they are high society guys. They're running the Dutch East India Company. They're involved in big port cities like Hamburg and in London and in Amsterdam. And they're in recreating their own tradition, they actually do almost a similar thing in some ways, if you think about it, to these guys here. Because the Spanish Portuguese Jews they've been mostly as living as Christians, as new Christians and secret Jews, crypto Jews. And then they go to Hamburg in 1580. And then they've been great businessmen in Portugal. And they use their business skills and they do amazingly well, but they have to recreate their tradition. So what they do is they get authentic Jewish music, not from the shtetl, but from Turkish and Moroccan cantors and Greek cantors Sephardic cantors that they bring in to get the authentic tradition, because those guys remember it, and we Portuguese ex-Christians don't. But they also bring in classical music straight from the Baroque period. You can find Lully, you can find opera, French opera quotations. You have them commissioning people like Giuseppe Lidarti, like Christians specifically, to write for their synagogue. You have melodies of Urlibusch was a German composer that would have been heard in the salons of Hamburg or Amsterdam, being written for Kadishim for their service. So the influence of Western classical music is really bigger in the Sephardi Portuguese area in that era amongst Ashkenazim until the late 18th century. Ashkenazim are poor, and so they get their music mostly from the street, from the tavern, the bar, from people caroling around and singing hymns and begging for money, and they get their music somewhat a little from reading notation, but they mostly get it from the oral world of the soundscape around them as poorer people.
Thank you. As we come to a conclusion, there's a couple more questions here, but one here is if you can recommend your favorite recordings by Russian Jewish composers or Jewish composers in general.
Oh, I would go anywhere on the Milken Archive, milkenarchive.org. There's a lot of this kind of stuff. You'll find it, and I would look for an upcoming CD of called "Art Songs of the Jewish Diaspora." You can Google it. It's by I think Asis Records. Ian Pomerantz is the bass baritone singing it, and he is for you guys who are in DC, you can hear him. He's singing Charpentier on this Sunday. Charpentier and what other French guy? Lully, I think, at the He's in part of the Washington Bach Consort. He's like one of their major soloists, and he's coming out with this CD in like 2 weeks. So it's Ian Pomerantz. If you Google Art Songs of the Jewish Diaspora, you'll find it. I'm reviewing it right now and writing about it on my Substack, so I'm a big fan of it. It's got a lot of this stuff, including one of the recordings you heard tonight.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll include some of these links and such in our follow-up so that everybody can find more information. So just as a kind of final question or final thoughts, along with if you want to end with a piano piece, however you feel you want to sort of bring our time together to a close.
Well, I just want to. I'll play a little more of one piece here that we got to just hear the beginning of. But I want to again just thank all of you for coming on tonight. Please feel free to contact me either through Substack or through my email if you have further questions. I'm just mattausterklein@gmail.com. You can email me directly. But let me do the screen sharing one more time so we can hear just one more dance from Saminsky, just because or the love song from Saminsky, just because they were very beautiful pieces. Okay, let me get to here. Okay, end of last piece. Now, beginning of our last piece for the evening. Sorry, didn't mean to stop it, but we'll end it there. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to honor Ms. Solomon and to be part of the Haberman Institute tonight.